Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a UK politics special, extra, whatever you want to call it. It won't be for everybody, and it probably won't be for those of you who are a really big fan of Reform UK. So Reform UK are this iteration, latest iteration of what was UKIP, became the Brexit party, and has now become Reform. Really, that's what's happened with the through line of Nigel Farage. Really started as an EU skeptic party, Eurosceptic party that was campaigning to get the UK out of the EU. Then became the Brexit party, which was, okay, let's try and work out how to do the best Brexit deal now that the UK is out of the EU. And then it transformed into a Reform party to try and get away from being a one-trick pony to say we need to reform the UK. But essentially, it is and I'm going to be careful with this because the right wing, left wing is a really simplistic paradigm. And actually, we should be thinking in terms of probably the political compass and authoritarianism, freedom, left economics, right economics. But as we generally understand it, Reform UK is a right wing populist party, just like many of the parties we see in Europe. I don't think it's significantly different to AFD, Rassemblement National, MAGA in MAGA republicanism, Confederation in Poland, towards the PIS, Law and Justice Party, and any number of the parties in Europe we could compare them to. Now, what happened, just a bit of background, because I think it's really important to understand this, because there will be people who, it will attempt to have a broad tent, okay? Because what happened in the 2016 Brexit referendum, EU referendum, is that people across the political divide voted for to leave the EU because predominantly, I would argue, it was about immigration, and then there was some post hoc rationalisation. Often, not always, there are some people who really genuinely believe strongly about sovereignty. When you look at the data, and I've talked through this before in the debate, when you look at the actual hard data, sovereignty didn't feature as an issue on people's minds until something like June 2016, until people were told that sovereignty is an issue. And then they added that on to the pre-existing issues that they had, which were predominantly to do with immigration and free movement of people. So as part of the four pillars of what the EU is, the free movement of goods and services and labour. We had free movement of people, right? And so there were lots of Europeans coming into the UK, particularly Eastern Europeans. There was a pushback to that, and that was, I think, the core of people's desire to vote for the UK to lead the EU. I don't really want to get into long weeds of that, but what this meant was that you had people who were anti-immigration who might have been sitting on the right economically. You had libertarians, even though movement of people is literally the most libertarian thing, which is why, interestingly, the Libertarian Party of the US, for example, is pro-migration. Because if you are truly libertarian, like where the individual is a god, and you don't want to be enforcing rules on the individual from some kind of governmental point of view, then actually to say you can't move from here to there goes against libertarianism, which is very interesting. I used to call, or I still do, what was UKIP then a faux libertarian party. So Nigel Farage used to say it was a libertarian party. It was like, well, if you're libertarian but fundamentally anti-immigration, and then you want to put some of these cultural rules on people, rules about religion, rules about about other things that get tagged on to that kind of movement, then actually it doesn't really look libertarian. So actually, if you are anti-immigration, you can't really be a proper kind of Ayn Rand libertarian. Okay, so what happened is you would have people who were kind of anti-immigration from different sectors, including working class, Labour voting, union members, right? And that's why the Labour Party didn't know where to sit with regard to Brexit, because it had its kind of middle class intellectual group more likely to vote Remain, and the working class Labour kind of union vote or former union voters, actually many of those going, yeah, we don't really like immigration, so we're going to vote Brexit. So when UKIP, then onto Brexit Party, then onto Reform, that evolution took place, there was this great understanding that they had quite a disparate bunch of people who were voting for them. What was actually a better predictor of voting for Reform and Brexit end up being socioeconomic status and actually education levels. You can argue about this, but this was true actually in the latest election with Reform as well. So, okay, you maybe go and find the support for that, because I shouldn't just give you mere assertions. So John Curtis is our big electoral analyst in the UK. Analysis of the local elections where Reform just did really, really well. Okay, they blew the main parties out of the water. Analysis of the English local elections by Sir John Curtis, quote, support for Reform averaged 43% in wards where more than half of adults have few, if any, educational qualifications. In contrast, it polled just 19% where more than 2 in 5 have a degree. This is totally in line with what we understood from Brexit. Okay, so there was a very strong correlation and therefore almost certainly a causation between, it depends how deep you want to go. Okay, let's just say correlation for sake of argument now, between educational levels and voting for Brexit. Because it might be so when I talk about the correlation versus causation, there's a correlation fallacy, which is this thing correlates with this thing, therefore this thing caused the other thing. Actually, this thing could be associated with something else, which that then caused this other thing. So there are associations that can really muddy what the actual causality is. So it might not be that a lack of formal education level caused a vote for Brexit, but you're more likely to have this job that then causes this thing, and then that causes you to vote for Brexit. Okay, so it gets complicated. Anyway, rewind. So the point is that Labour understood that they had this kind of mixed tent whereby some of their voters voted for Brexit, and the same with the Conservatives as well. So some people were very Brexit from a Eurosceptic, small government, kind of like higher educational level point of view, if you like, potentially, from the Conservative point of view, and then mixes of lots of those things, and lots of working class people didn't vote for Brexit as well. So it's we're looking at general trends, and if you're going to put in the comment below, but I wasn't like this, and I found this really important, that's why I voted. Brilliant. Okay, well done you. This isn't about you then. We're talking about generalizations here, and the data does support this. Okay, so the history then of Reform is that it has, or I guess not so much the history or the genesis of Reform, but where Reform needs to go from now is to get elected if they're a serious political party. But in order to get elected, they have to have a suite of policies that appeal to those kind of left-wing unionized voters, as well as those right-wing small government non-regulation type. Okay, well, those two things are fairly opposite in our normal political understanding. So how does this work with Reform? And what that meant is that Reform's manifesto last time, what they called a contract, was kind of all over the place, and some of the stuff they had in was pretty good. Like some pretty good stuff on, say, nursing and other things where they understood that we have some kind of fairly traditionally left-wing working class voters that we need to appeal to. That's going to be their challenge going forward as well. Now, the other challenge they've got is that they are a populist party that is run by elites, and they're trying to set the people against the elites. So populism is usually understood as trying to engender a movement of people, the populace, to rise up against us and them, the elites, right? And this is the same that we've seen in the US with MAGA rise up against establishment politicians. But the problem is you're replacing an elite of establishment politicians in the US with MAGA with billionaires and tech bros, right? And you're like, hang on, there's an even worse elite. You've replaced this, what you see as a political elite, with a technological and moneyed elite. Oh my goodness, that's not going to end well for you. And so you're starting to get this real movement in the United States against oligarchy, right? Well, when you look at reform, when you look at the politicians of reform, whether it be Rupert Lowe, Nigel Farage, and Richard Tice, these are moneyed elites, right? And they're trying to give you this idea that they are the everyman, right? And this 2019 article from The Independent really sums it up, because this is going to be a challenge for reform going forward, is if you really are a populist political party, then you need to get away from the fact that most of your big players are moneyed elites. Nigel Farage is an elitist selling a brand, and you won't get your money back when he fails. Okay, so I just find it interesting here. Nigel Farage is a wealthy, privately educated former stockbroker who despises the EU but has lived off its pay and perks for years. Behind the brand of a man with a pint lies a member of a very elite he says is betraying the people. The very elite he says is betraying the people. He is playing a very dangerous game. He is being dishonest with people, because if Brexit happens, he'll be okay whatever the outcome. The rest of us will have to live with the catastrophe of the no-deal Brexit he proposes. He needs to be honest, but he won't be. So anyway, it is, I think, important to note exactly who he is. I've seen so many adverts on YouTube of him trying to get people to sign up to his kind of finance market newsletter, like how to manipulate the markets and whatnot. You're like, are you really the everyman that you're claiming you are? Anyway, so what's happened is reform gained in the local English elections, as in for your councillors, loads of seats, right? Loads of councillors won their race because there's this real move, as we've seen around the world, of anti-establishment voting, and people are just sick of politicians. They're all the same, that kind of thing. I've told you before, that really annoys me, and it's lazy. It's actually just lazy thinking. Because you can't be bothered to actually learn the difference between all these politicians. And to think that the Green Party is the same as the Lib Dems, the same as the Conservative Party, is the same as the Labour Party, is the same as Plaid Cymru and SNP, and so on and so forth, is just lazy thinking. So don't just vote reform because they're anti-establishment, because actually you're probably biting off your nose to spite your face. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. The stuff that Nigel Farage wants to get through is a complete ripping out of regulation. Well, who's that going to hurt the most? Actually, the working class. What he wants to do, the NHS, who's that going to hurt the most? The working class. And so he's trying to give you this sense that he's a working class champion, or champion for the working class, when actually he's the exact opposite. Now, their success meant that in the local council elections, loads of people needed to be, they knew they were going to get a success. They could feel this brewing. And so they basically got loads and loads of councillor candidates, but they were unable to really vet them. And so you had a lot of very, very shoddy people representing reform, but people didn't really know who they're voting for, because you don't really know your local councillor candidates. You just go down and say, it becomes really a reflection of your national political sentiments. You don't think this person's going to fix potholes better than that person. You're just like, I prefer this party to that party, so I'm going to vote for this person for my local council elections. And so Nigel Farage knew there was going to be an issue, because it had been an issue previously with vetting. And so he had promised that they would vet better, because they'd had loads of people previously in the general election that were going for MP positions, members of parliament, who were really dodgy and crap. And the problem with what I would say is broadly a right-wing populist party, even though they might have elements of left-wing economic policy or trying to appeal to a larger tent, they're broadly a right-wing populist party, is that you are going to attract an awful lot of the extreme. So in the UK, you have like the English Defence League and Britain First, these political movements that are far right movements. There's no other way of describing Britain First. They're a far right movement, very much like MAGA and some, right? Like the more extreme of MAGA. And they are a nefarious bunch of people. But they are going to be a core demographic pool that you're going to draw from in order to get enough people to run for councillor and actually for MP. And so they've always had an issue with attracting people from the far right to run. And then when you look back at their backgrounds, these are bad people. These are just, I'm sorry, they're just not very nice people. And that's what's happened. So, I mean, and this is going back to May the 11th. So this is 10 days old now. And this is just a few days after those council elections. Recently elected Reform councillors resigning has now hit 22. So just a short while after the elections, 22 councillors had already had to resign for a whole suite of different reasons. Each by-election will cost £10,000 of taxpayers' money, and all because none of them had any intention of doing the job in the first place. $250,000 cost so far. In fact, it was such a problem that there's just been this piece in the week here. Reform UK's councillors are off to a rocky start. 3 weeks after sweeping the local elections, Nigel Farage's insurgent party is beginning to realise how hard the path from rhetoric to reality really is. Now, if there's nothing else you're going to take away from this video, it's that, and I said this before, I warned you that when you have parties like this, they're not very good at ruling because they don't know how to rule, because they don't have the experience, because they're usually a bunch of people cobbled together mainly under a single ideology of being anti-immigration. Okay, anti-immigration, fair enough. We can have a debate about immigration. But if that's all you really care about and actually kind of know about, and when I say know, actually the nuances of immigration and the economic impact of cutting off immigration, you probably don't know about. You're probably just fighting from the gut here. Now, if that's what is drawing most people to reform, and then they get really interested and want to become a councillor, there's going to be an issue with actually having the requisite knowledge and ability to do the job of being a councillor, or right up to doing the job of being a member of parliament. And I've made this argument before that sometimes you have to vote these people in order for people to realise how crap they are, to then not vote them in again. So if you keep frustrating Rassemblement National and AFD and Reform from ever properly getting into power, and if you form coalitions so that they can never get into power, people just think, they get frustrated and go, oh, you're frustrating my political desires. We need to let these people, they're great. They're the anti-establishment answer to everything. And actually, because they never get power, you assume that they could be this great, marvelous political entity. And so they actually end up getting more and more popular. Whereas kind of what you want is to lance the boil, which is to say, let these people get into power, let them show you how crap they are, and then you go, oh, actually, they're crap, I'm not going to vote for them again. And kind of this is what's happening at the moment. So I think they've had control of one council. Before these elections, they had one council control, I think, did they, that went bust. You know, people are saying, if you look at the form of these guys, actually, they're not so good. But anyway, here we've got like a mainstream media article looking into this. When Reform UK won 2 mayoralties, 677 council seats, and overall control of 10 councils earlier this month, it was hailed as a political tsunami. 3 weeks on from those results, Reform is beginning to face up to the enormous challenges that local government poses, particularly for a party that's been so rapidly thrust into the positions of political power, said Local Government Chronicle. And already there are signs that things could get messy, said The Independent. Embarrassing councillors. So Nigel Farage hailed his party's election success as proof that Reform had professionalised. But just a few weeks on, the truth is beginning to emerge, said the New European, as newly elected Reform councillors begin to quit, wasting tens of thousands of pounds of taxpayers' money on by-election costs for their replacements. Des Clark resigned from Nottinghamshire County Council just days after being elected, citing significant changes to his personal circumstances. Donna Edmonds, elected to Hodnet in Shropshire, was also stepped down after being suspended from the party just 48 hours after her election for social media posts about her plans to defect. Andrew Kilburn quit his post in Durham after failing to declare that he worked for the council. Luke Shingler, who was elected in Warwickshire, is now serving as an independent because the RAF job prohibits him from representing a political party. And Staffordshire Reform Councillor Wayne Titley resigned for personal reasons after posting on social media that the Royal Navy should use a volley of gunfire to sink small boats crossing the channel, and so on and so forth. Despite Reform's pledge to vet candidates, quote, rigorously at all levels, an investigation by the Telegraph, of all places, has uncovered other statements by a number of the party's new councillors that may prove embarrassing, including a Ku Klux Klan joke in response to meeting of Grenfell Tower survivors. Ouch, that's pretty poor form there. All this raises questions about whether Farage, quote, has what it takes to build a serious political machine. A part of the problem lies in Reform's sheer unexpected success at the ballot box, said The Independent. It's meant many paper candidates, those who were not expected to win, were now elected with a job that they didn't particularly want to do. And there's kind of the point. Is when you have to put in so many councillors because you're actually contesting all these seats and they end up getting elected. Some of these, there was one report I read where a Reform councillor was voted in, but no one had a picture of him. There was no knowledge of him. He had never turned up to anything. There was just like the name and put in, and people have voted for him. So it's clearly not on like expertise of this particular person. It's just I want Reform to win. This guy gets elected in, and then no one's got a clue who this person is, and he hadn't turned up, so it might not even exist. I don't know what happened with that one, but here's the issue with such an expansion so quickly. So, yeah, Reform has very clearly signalled that its approach will be confrontational, said the Covert Council in Prospect magazine. Deputy leader Richard Tice has announced a war against renewable energy projects, more of that soon, and diversity initiatives. Reform councils will only fly the Union flag, St George's flag and county flags, banning shows of solidarity with war-torn Ukraine, for instance. So there you go. This is who these guys are. These are kind of your typical MAGA, not going to fly the Ukraine flag anywhere on council properties and so on and so forth. So I just see these as pretty much MAGA, but also AFD, Rassemblement National. And there's a similar issue that Reform are finding that is similar to, say, the FPO in Austria, or AFD in Germany, is that other parties won't do coalition deals with them. So Reform have got the largest number of seats on Cornwall County. So it's the one in the southwest of England, very southwest of England. In fact, very high Brexit voting council that ended up realising that it received an awful lot of EU funding. Cornwall's quite famous for shooting itself in the foot. So it got tons of EU funding, voted to lead the EU, and then promptly got a lot of funding taken away, and it was ouch. Also, you find the places with the least amount of immigration often had, places like Cornwall often had the highest kind of Leave vote share and Reform support and whatnot as well. That's another interesting correlation there. So anyway, here the other parties are refusing to kind of go into partnership with Reform. So even though they've got 28 seats on the council, they are unable to form a working majority of 44 seats, and all the other parties are getting together now to run the council without a coalition with Reform. And so that's an issue for them. But talking about rushing into getting councillors and whatnot, you get a situation. So here's, and I don't want to be like ageist or reversed ageist, but like, are these two kids going to have enough knowledge about how to run a council, about life experience to know, this guy on the right is somewhat in charge of adult social care? I mean, I don't know. I find this a bit problematic. These two are in charge of our adult social care and both of them, and children's services in Leicestershire. I mean, wow. And actually, the guy on the right is thoroughly problematic. So we have This guy, the guy on the right, is actually had formerly a Twitter handle, Lord Joseph Boehm, saying going on strike is completely and utterly disrespectful towards your employers. You're not offering to do more for more money. You just want more. If you don't like how much you're being paid, and get a different job. Great spelling here. To pay you more, money must be taken from somewhere else. I mean, I have been on strike many times before as a teacher, or a number of times before, and it's a hit to your wallet, and you do it because you care. I care deeply for the working rights of teachers at the time when I was a teacher, and so I would just go absolutely nuts at this. Now we're going to return to that idea, and so that idea is interesting because we're going to return to unions in a little while and how this could be a bit of a problem for reform. So anyway, that's one of his views. Joseph Boehm has GCSE down on his LinkedIn. He only got 1 out of 9 taken. Okay, then flunked out of college doing media studies. Okay, fair enough. As cabinet member for adult social care, I'm already learning so much about what goes on behind the scenes. It's a complex but fascinating area that affects so many lives. Privileged to be a part of shaping it for the better, he says. And then this is adult social care, right? This is what he previously said before he became a counsellor. Depression isn't real. You feel sad, you continue with life because there's no alternative. You'll always be depressed if your life is depressing. Fix it. So he's a guy in charge of adult social care as someone who is barely an adult. He is also quite a big supporter of Andrew Tate, it seems. So Reform councillor Alexander Jones, who failed to be mayor of Doncaster, was a bit of an Andrew Tate fanboy. He's now councillor for Edenthorpe and Kirk Sandal. Now, so this is another guy from the guy I was just talking about. But the guy I was just talking about, Boehm, has himself given Andrew Tate. I haven't got it. Have I got it here? No. But he has been a supporter. I think it's down below here. Here it is. Yes. So if we come back to here, it is. I've got it somewhere. Meet Joseph Boehm, chairman of Northwest Leicestershire branch, standing in Whitwick division. On a now deleted Twitter account, he regularly retweeted Andrew Tate with messages like "resist the slave mind" and "hello Mr. Tate" with an emoji of a goat, greatest of all time. So Andrew Tate is a part of the manosphere, misogynist, up for rape. In fact, I think he's going to be extradited to the UK. He's a horrible human being. But this is a sort of ecosystem that many people, I'm not saying all people in reform are like this, right? But there is an element, or there's a really strong, very strong element of these sorts of people attracted to reform. And I think that is dangerous for our political landscape. And when I say these sorts of people, so here's another example. Steve Biggs is a Britain First supporter and pro-Putin. So if you're worried about Ukraine like myself, this is the sort of people like this. Rather similar to the most MAGA of people in the US who end up being pro-Putin, you've got an element of that in reform. This is what you voted for, Durham. County Durham Reform Councillor Steve Biggs is reported to have posted on social media in the past, "Islam has no place on this earth. One big nuke bomb needed." I tried to question him about it. He asked the council neighbourhood warden, "Could you get rid of him, please?" So obviously not up for being challenged on anything, but also pro-Putin and Britain First. So it appears to be sitting on the far right. And plenty. I mean, we could look at a whole number of these. So James Regan in Epping Forest, Essex. Also, giving the whole free Tommy Robinson. So that kind of approach. So yeah, Tommy Robinson is definitely not someone I would advocate for, and I think that's just a sign that you are. If you're a fan of Tommy Robinson, you sit on the further end of the right spectrum to a problematic degree. Here's a woman, one of their candidates, I believe, not just a candidate, was a candidate for Carshalton South and Clockhouse in the forthcoming by-election on 22nd May. So she is a candidate. A vote for Reform UK's Arlene Dearlove this Thursday is a vote for Britain First. So again, Britain First as free Tommy Robinson and all that kind of stuff. She seems to be a fan of. So yeah, there is definitely a much greater propensity of these sorts of people associated with reform. Norfolk's newest councillor already in hot water over his social media posts, so on and so forth. So there is this issue with a number of people who are up for representing reform because they see reform as, I think, being anti-immigration, and that's what drives them to be a councillor. But if that's all you stand for, then that's fairly one-dimensional, and actually it probably shows that kind of I'm not saying there aren't genuine issues with immigration, right? But this kind of anti-immigration stance is usually associated with some form of racism. Now, Daily Telegraph, which is your bulwark of conservatism, right, has an article, and here's the issue for the Conservative Party, is that do they go further to the right in order to appease reform voters and get those reform voters back, but then lose the moderate centrists and centre-right, and then lose them maybe to Lib Dems? Or do they try to go for old school conservatism, like Reagan republicanism, if you like, but then lose the right to reform and then don't get into power? So they're now having to work out whether they merge with reform and what that means for them going forward. But Telegraph here, new reform councillors posted about Tommy Robinson and demolishing mosques. So they are pointing out that there's an issue with the vetting. And in fact, if we go to the beginning, you'll understand here what Nigel Farage understood as being a challenge for them. Quote, "We don't want bigots. We don't want people who think that way because we represent the silent, decent majority of this great country," Nigel Farage declared at Reform UK's annual conference last September. Now, that's quite famous because this was a moment where he understood that they were attracting a lot of bigots, but in order to get into power, you can't. We've seen this with Rassemblement National, which is you have to kind of keep reinventing yourself until you become, and this is what I'd argue has actually happened. You know, I would take that evolution of UKIP through Brexit Party to Reform. I'd actually go back further because there are elements of the National Front. You know, you've got Britain First here. Like, you can be as pro-reform as you like, but you can't deny there's elements of Britain First here because we've seen it. There's evidence of it in front of your eyes there. Okay. I think you've had National Front, and then in the old days, and then the British National Party, the BNP, and then these parties keep trying to reinvent themselves until they become popular enough, until they've moderated the worst extremes, until they're just getting into being acceptable, and the Overton window maybe gets moved as well, and then they're there. And then they start getting elected. Now, the National Front and the BNP never got there. And then then the EU debate all happened. And there could be elements of that movement that attached itself to UKIP. And of course, I am not saying that was what people, all Leave voters. But what I'm interested in doing is seeing the evolution of the far right in the UK and what's happened to that movement over time, because actually you'll find that the English Defence League and Britain First and BNP and National Front and all, whether they exist or not presently, they are not going to get elected, but Reform is going to get elected, and you'll find that Reform are attracting those old school elements of the far right, as well as people who aren't far right, of course, and as well as people who are just anti-establishment. But that means, Farage knows that, right? And he knew that last year at this big conference where he said, we can't have bigots in our party. Like, for him to say that, he understands that that's an issue, right? So if any of you are spitting at the screen because you think I'm mischaracterizing Reform, I'm definitely not, because Nigel Farage admitted that, right? All I'm doing is agreeing with Nigel Farage. If I was in charge of Reform now, I would be working out how to get into power, which is to moderate our worst excesses until we become acceptable to enough people to get the votes to beat, and we split the Conservative Party vote. So we somehow need to deal with that so that we can either get all of those votes or completely destroy the Conservative Party. So we either merge with the Conservative Party or destroy them so completely and utterly. And he understood this. It was in such spirit, says the Telegraph, that Reform pledged it would be vetting candidates rigorously at all levels ahead of the local elections on May the 1st. The party was adamant it had turned over a new leaf, having encountered vetting problems during the 2024 general election when parliamentary candidates with extremist views had slipped through the net. And that's the problem. When you need so many people and you're actually a small political party without the infrastructure of, say, the Conservative Party or the Labour Party, you don't have necessarily the money, the time, the infrastructure to be able to do all this vetting, so people get through very easily. But after Reform's historic poll sweep this month, in which it won 677 council seats, a Telegraph investigation has found a series of statements from a number of the party's new councillors that may prove embarrassing. So on and so forth. So this is where we had the reference to Ku Klux Klan and Tommy Robinson, so on and so forth. So there is that. The issue with generating enough electable candidates who aren't batshit crazy and extremist, right? And actually have a decent knowledge or life experience to be able to do the job that you're electing them to do. Unfortunately, what happens is you just elect in local councillor elections your national party preference, irrespective of who it is on the ballot. Now, Nigel Farage has then said, right, we've done so well in the local elections that we had to bring out a kind of stopgap manifesto so that people know actually what we stand for. So you've got a double page spread in the Daily Mail. Of course, it would be the Daily Mail. Nigel Farage has released Reform UK's manifesto via the Daily Mail, and it's every bit as unhinged and unserious as you'd expect. Let's break it down with facts. So this is some guy reacting to this. Okay. So just to give you the title in the Daily Mail, after his huge gains in a local election, Nigel Farage is now favourite to be PM. Whether you support him or not, his radical manifesto is essential reading. Here's what my Reform government would do, he said. So the big headlines, 6 big headlines. No income tax below £20,000. So that's appealing to your working class, right? Or to your low socioeconomic status. So I forget what the... Is it raising it? Well, obviously a number of £1,000. You have that threshold where if you earn below a certain amount, then you don't have to. It's not 17,000, is it? Where you don't have to pay tax. Oh, sorry, I was way off. Actually, I was thinking of 16,000. 16 hours, 17 hours a week, where things change with regard to working hours and benefits. It's 12,570. Up to that, you get 0% tax rate, and then 20% tax rate from 12,570 to 50,270. So up to 12,500, he's going to raise that to 20,000. So that is definitely appealing to your working class. Appoint a minister for deportation. So they want to deport the crap out of people. That's a kind of Homan type person for ICE in the US. Tom Homan. Ditch net zero. So he's anti-environment. For some reason, the environment is evil. And so, he's saying that if we are going to try and decarbonize, then that's costing us too much. So we shouldn't do that. Scrap inheritance tax under 2 million. So now you're like, okay. I've written articles on inheritance tax and why you should have inheritance tax, and it's a redistribution of wealth. And as long as you ring fence that to support equality of opportunity, that's an absolute must. Now it gets difficult because everyone thinks that they're a frustrated millionaire. So you think, why should you take my money? But actually, inheritance tax, like if I was a millionaire, right, and I gave my boys my inheritance, I died and gave them all that money, what have they done to deserve that? What have they done to merit my money? And of course, they've done nothing. They were just luckily born as my children. In other words, it's got about as much merit as walking up to 2 random children on the streets and giving them £1 million, right? Not that I'm a millionaire, obvs. But you get the point. So, what that then does is it keeps wealth within a privileged family setup where wealth begets wealth. And same with property, so you can transfer wealth with property very easily, and that just prolongs privilege throughout time. And it's not there's not a meritocracy. So all this, I remember Theresa May, I wrote an article on this years back when Theresa May, the Prime Minister of the UK, said, right, a kind of on your bikes type thing, a bit like John Major from a Conservative Prime Minister point of view. She is saying, I want a true meritocracy to take place here. You need to get on your bikes and go out, and you should work hard. And if you work hard, then you deserve to be rewarded for that. And the whole speech was about meritocracy. But in that speech, she also said, and by the way, we're raising the thresholds for inheritance tax. It's like, you've just spent all this time talking about meritocracy, and you've then introduced the most unmeritocratic policy that you can think of, which is a way of prolonging privilege through inheritance. Just, it made no sense to me. So I wrote an article on that. But here's an interesting point to be made: is that no income tax below 20,000. Sort out poor people. Get your poor people on board. Scrap inheritance tax under 2 million. Appeal to your rich people or your aspiring rich people. And there you go. End war on farmers and pensioners. Drill, baby, drill. It's like he's taken this from Trump. So this person says, no income tax below 20,000. Sounds great until you realise it would cost the UK nearly £50 billion per year in lost revenue. No mention of how it's paid for. And this is the thing. When you are a fringe party, so they're still fringe enough to be able to get away with promising the world and not telling you how they're going to deliver it. And they'll still get voted in. Now, it wouldn't happen the second time. You'd be like, how are you costing this? But the first time they can get away with, I think, still promising the moon, even though it's impossible. So yeah, 50 billion it will cost in lost revenue. No mention of how it's paid for. Spoiler, they don't know. You can't fund the NHS with vibes. Scrap inheritance tax on estates under £2 million. This helps the wealthiest 4% of the population. Everyone else gets nothing. Another few billion lost in lost revenue from those taxes to help people who already have mansions. Appoint a minister or for deportations. This already exists. It's called the Home Office. All this does is create a scapegoat when they inevitably fail to stop the boats. Ditch net zero. This would violate the UK's Climate Change Act, break international law, destroy green investment and kill off thousands of future-proof jobs. It's economic vandalism wrapped in fossil fuel nostalgia. I couldn't have put that better myself. Drill, baby, drill. Okay, UK oil won't lower your energy bill. Why? Because energy is traded globally. More drilling just enriches oil firms and delays investment in renewables. We need clean, cheap energy, not 1970s cosplay. Open for business while cutting ties with the European Convention on Human Rights. That makes Britain a legal wildcard, not a reliable trading partner. Investors want stability, not chaos and Daily Mail headlines. Fix the NHS. How? By cutting GP waste and hoping for the best. With £50 billion less in tax revenue, this is a slogan, not a plan. There's no detail, no staffing solution, no funding model, just more wishful thinking. So that's the NHS one that's in there, but not in one of those bullet points. So that's a problem. And The Economist knows this as well. So these guys are the experts. Nigel Farage's economic plans are a disaster. 3 choices: fiscal implosion, deep austerity, or a hasty U-turn. Reform's manifesto from the 2024 election is a starting point. The party has since crab-walked away from the document, but it remains the only entry under policies on its website. More tellingly, Mr Farage has specifically reaffirmed or expanded on nearly half the tax cuts listed in recent months. The manifesto puts reforms giveaways at £140 billion in total, 5% of the GDP per year, but claims to offset them with savings worth £160 billion. Even on a generous but realistic accounting, The Economist estimates that the annual costs are in the region of 200 billion and savings around 100 billion, and it gives you a chart to help you along with that. The gap between the two would amount to a colossal fiscal shock, blowing up the deficit and straining the gilt market to its limits. Why the mismatches? Taxes first. The changes are so vast that precise costings are futile, but Reform has made serially generous guesses. The party claims its personal tax cuts cost 70 billion a year, but the proposed lift to income tax thresholds would alone would cost at least that much, probably more, based on rules of thumb from HMRC, the tax agency. Adding cuts to fuel duty, stamp duty, VAT, inheritance tax, and more adds tens of billions. Recently, Mr Farage has doubled down on the single costliest pledge to lift the personal allowance for income tax from 12,570 to 20,000, and he now wants to fully abolish inheritance tax. fully abolish it. Wow. The manifesto promises businesses £18 billion of giveaways too, but the promise to cut corporation tax by 10% points alone is worth double that. And the realistic take from one of Reform's main revenue raisers, dropping some interest payments on Bank of England reserves, is a mere fraction of the 35 billion stated. And then comes spending. Reform wants 30 to 40 billion more for health, defence and fighting crime. To pay and cover tax cuts, the party relies on hand-waving and austerity. Questionably, it asserts that its policies will add 1 percentage point to growth, a near doubling, and take 1 million Britons off benefits. In addition, it suggests a 5% cut across government, austerity not far off the 2010s, plus unfathomably vast savings from ending net zero. And by the way, all of those things would actually really hurt the very many working class people who would be voting for them and the people at the lower end of the socioeconomic status spectrum. So it's a bit of a hot mess, their kind of economic predicament, and actually who they are truly appealing to. Anyway, let's move on. So Nigel Farage here says Reform UK councillors are being instructed to take part in DEI and climate change training. Diversity, equity, inclusion. This is all terrible. We shouldn't have inclusion, and we shouldn't have climate change training. We shouldn't have any expenditure on tackling climate change. Our new elected officials will do no such things because we believe all people should be treated equally. Now, so what you've had is a bunch of mayoral candidates and people who've been elected in and councillors saying we're going to get rid of net zero, we're going to stop all kind of renewable energy expenditure and blah, blah, blah. The problem is that is economic suicide at a time when we are trying to future-proof our economy. If you should see renewable energy and green tech not so much from an environmental point of view, but from a economic point of view by predicting the future. So the best thing you can do is just forget about the environment and just think, what is the best tech for 20 years down the line? Like solar panels and wind farms, or whatever, like green tech that's even more efficient, whatever it is, hydrogen cars. Or are we still going to be like focusing on subsidizing fossil fuel industries? So Reform now have mayors in East Riding of Yorkshire and in Lincolnshire. They plan to push back against all climate action and renewables projects, says Chris Smith. Here's a summary of what major renewables projects have delivered thus far in both regions. In other words, if you're just going to get rid of net zero and destroy renewable energy infrastructure investment, then you're biting off the hand that feeds you. So it says East Riding of Yorkshire, where they've now got a mayor. The Siemens blade factory, so blades for big wind turbines, established in Hull in 2016 and delivered 310 million in manufacturing investment. In 2021, a further investment of 186 million was made to double the size of the factory. It now employs 1,200 people. Dogger Bank offshore wind farm will connect to the grid in Cottingham. As a result, the region will gain from a £25 million community fund that will support education and skills training. Grimsby East Coast Hub, a new operations base, was established in Grimsby to service offshore wind projects. The base now supports Hornsea, Triton Knoll, Humber Gateway, Sophia, Dogger Bank, Links, Lynn, Dowsing, Racebank. These are all offshore wind farms. The Grimsby East Coast Hub now supports over 1,200 employees. The hub is now the largest in Europe. It will expand significantly in scale and employment with the new offshore projects currently in planning and construction. Lincolnshire, the Hornsey 1 and 2 offshore wind farms are connected to the grid in North Killingham via the underground cables. As a result, Lincolnshire benefits from direct employment of the project, and the community fund and has thus far paid out £8 in local project. I presume that's £8 million. The Humber Gateway project will deliver £200,000 into community projects in Lincolnshire. The Triton Knoll project will deliver a total of £1.7 million, and so on and so forth. He goes through all of these different projects and the renewable projects taking, being carried out at the moment, and all the jobs that they bring. The low carbon economy has been valued at £1.2 billion per annum for Lincolnshire alone. Private investment is predicted to be £60 billion over the next 15 years across Greater Lincolnshire. And so, he's saying, look, what are you doing when you are just slagging off all of this investment that's coming in. This is future-proofing the economy. These are sustainable jobs going forward. And then you've had Andrea Jenkins, who is the Reform UK's mayor in one of those two areas. I forget which one. Let's have a look. She's a Lincolnshire, and she's a former Conservative MP, right? And she's defected over to Reform, and she said we're going to stop net zero and blah blah blah. But of course, when you look, because she kind of has to sell that stuff because that's a platform, that's Nigel Farage's thing. Andrea Jenkins, eco zealot, Reform UK's Andrea Jenkins, and also Reform UK's Andrea Jenkins. The solar farm is a blight to the countryside, net zero madness, or fantastic leadership and innovation. Andrea? So this is what she's just said. A solar farm planned in Lincolnshire, the equivalent size of 1,360 football pitches, all to reach Miliband's crazy net zero. If, like me, you wouldn't want this blighting the countryside, ensure your voice is heard. Ready to join a campaign to stop this? And then this was her just a few years ago. Delighted to open Coca-Cola Wakefield's solar farm today. Great to promote fantastic leadership and innovation in our area. So, when it's convenient, this is great stuff. And when it's sloganeering and whatnot, then it's highly controversial. There she is opening a solar farm before she joined the Reform UK bandwagon, Dame Net Zero. So there's that issue to do with net zero and the economics of the future. I want to go back to unions and the working class and reform. And I was saying to you earlier that if you're attracting people across from the working class, then you've got an issue, because actually Nigel Farage is deeply anti-union, deeply anti-workers' rights, really, and more about giving tax breaks for the rich. So he's like, it's the weirdness of MAGA republicanism attracting the working class in America. So where the Democrats used to stand up for the Rust Belt, the kind of good union jobs in the auto industry and whatnot, there's been this move where the working class now seems to be supporting MAGA republicanism more, probably because of things like immigration, right? But the problem is that if you distract people with immigration, you smuggle in all these other policies that are counterproductive for those people that you've attracted. And here is a great illustration of this. This has come from LBC. So Reform UK is not invited to the historic Durham Miners Gala, despite winning a council landslide. So just give you a background, some of these towns up north in County Durham and Durham and Derbyshire and all these areas where Reform have done really quite well, but predominantly because they're working class, lower education areas in terms of the kind of demographic you've got. These are places that have a strong mining heritage and unionized workers. And while you've lost union workers, where you've had maybe someone's grandparents were someone's granddad was a miner, but now there isn't that kind of, the mines are closed down and there isn't that present day union affiliation. Those families are sort of drifting away from that old Labour heritage and across to Reform and whatnot. But those who still understand the heritage of these unionised areas understand that Reform UK are the very worst party to stand up for those kinds of people. And this is really well expressed in this article. Reform UK not invited to historic Durham Miners Gala despite winning a council landslide. So they've absolutely smashed the council up there. They've got loads of councillors, but they're not being invited to this big Durham Miners Gala. So there's a picture of the 139th Durham Miners Gala. It won't have any Reform UK politician personally invited. Now, why is that? So Reform UK have been criticised in the city after one elected councillor was forced to resign after failing to declare blah blah blah. So all those issues with that, but in In April, the DMA, Durham Miners Association, published a message for members urging them not to vote for Farage's party. It read, "Reform are not on your side." This is such an important message for me. They listed 7 reasons that Farage's track record does not make pleasant reading for workers. This is where we are going to go back full circle. So hopefully when I do these videos, it all kind of makes sense and there is a thread. So the thread here is that this man is an elitist and doesn't give a shit about the working class, other than a means to an end for his power. So when you have, or at least Labour Party of old, you'd have someone like Arthur Scargill, like love him or hate him. A lot of people hated him, but, he was standing up for the miners' rights back in the, miners against, the privatisation through Margaret Thatcher and whatnot. But you'd have these candidates who used to be, and really interestingly, this isn't the case with Labour anymore. I was listening to an analysis recently on Arrested Politics where they say actually the amount of working class Labour representatives now has gone right down as they've drifted towards this middle class intellectual sort of thing. People like myself, right? Left-leaning geeks who sit around moralising about left, right and centre, right? That's kind of where Labour's drifted to. I'm not big time Labour supporter. I'm kind of anyone but Tory. So, but they've left behind their Labour heritage, and actually that's reflected in the sorts of the Labour MPs you have now are much more likely to be like degree holding whatevers, rather than your working class come through, this working class life and bringing along that heritage with them. But anyway, here the idea that reform are somehow better, though. I mean, so Labour have got worse for the working class, arguably, at least in representation. But reform, when you look at the top of reform, they definitely don't have the working class at heart. So here are the 7 reasons. They included the Reform UK leaders' opposition to taxing very rich corporations, backing tax cuts for the wealthiest in society, and this support for replacing our state-funded NHS with the introduction of the healthcare insurance. In other words, he is Donald Trump 2.0. The list of grievances also included not choosing to protect workers on zero-hour contracts during his time in the European Parliament. I mean, in the European Parliament, he was poor, Nigel Farage. He didn't do anything to protect anything British. He just was like the bogeyman for the EU, just slagging off the EU at all times that when he was there, but most of the time he wasn't there. He was actually not turning up to fisheries meetings, and he had the worst voting record, bar one, of all 750 members of the EU, of the European Parliament, and he just didn't turn up at all to Brussels as much as he should have done. Anyway, the list of grievances, so the damning DMA message included a quote from Farage saying, "I supported Margaret Thatcher, she was right. It may have caused a little pain for some, but it had to happen." So when you're talking about places with this huge mining heritage, to hear the Reform UK leaders say, "I supported Margaret Thatcher's position," irrespective of if I was to be canny, right, even if I thought that, I thought, well, yeah, the mining industry was dying and she just expedited it to try and blah, 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 right? Even if I believed that Margaret Thatcher did wholly the right thing there, I would just be careful with what I said, because I know that I've got a lot of working class people from mining communities that I'm trying to attract to Reform UK. So the year-long miners' strike in 1984-5 was an attempt to stop Thatcher from closing coal mines across Britain. The union urged members ahead of the mayor local elections, if you vote for Reform UK, you are voting for an old Tory push-by millionaire who was fine with throwing miners on the dole, closing pits and destroying our communities. A vote for Reform is a vote for the policies of Thatcher. And absolutely, in 2020, Mr. Maldum paraphrased Boris Johnson to say he would rather die in a ditch than see Red Wall Conservative MPs attend the event. This has happened previously with Conservative MPs that have gained popularity up in these northern areas more recently, and now Reform are on the verge of sweeping some of these northern places. Reform UK just is not going to be the party that is going to be more beneficial for the poor in the UK. They just won't be. Now, just a few points on immigration, because the whole kind of, we're also full on in support of Brexit. It's just worth noting, and all the major news sites, Sky News here, actually was on ITV as well, and BBC were talking about this, the soaring rise in immigration since we completed Brexit.
This is net migration, the difference, as you all know by now, between people arriving and leaving the UK. For years, it bumped along the bottom here. I say the bottom, 200 to 300,000 was still quite controversial. But look how it soared since we completed Brexit, almost touching 1 million at its peak, before then falling slightly.
So Brexit has precipitated a massive immigration explosion, the exact opposite of what it was hoping to do. Let's look at the BBC News, say pretty much similar thing.
In the 30 years before the mid-1990s, the number arriving minus the number leaving was effectively zero. But from 1994 onwards, it began to climb, jumping during Labour's time in office in the early 2000s, then another jump in 2021 after changes that eased the criteria needed for work visas. This despite the Brexit referendum in 2016.
And of course, it was the Conservatives in charge at the time during this precipitous rise. So BBC News observed migration shot up after Brexit in 2020, but doesn't explain that ending free movement with the EU means we replace temporary workers from the EU with permanent workers from India, Nigeria, and elsewhere around the world. So this deep irony that many people, and I know so many people, like most of my family, most of my partner's family particularly, voted Brexit and are massively pro-Brexit, right? To the point where there's also not a little bit of racism involved as well. And I can say that from first-hand experience, right? But let's just say immigration was a driving force for virtually all the people I know from immediate friends and family who voted for Brexit were immigration. A couple of people further afield were a bit more highfalutin about it, but actually when it boiled down, it was broadly, there was like talk of sovereignty, but they'd never voiced a concern about sovereignty like 3 years previously. So, make that what you will. It doesn't explain the ending of free movement people. Yeah, so what happened? You had this irony of stopping Eastern Europeans like Poles and Romanians coming into the UK. All these bloody Polish plumbers coming here and doing a good job on my house. So it's like, yeah, we want to stop that. Yeah. Close that down. So, okay, Brexit, brilliant. We're out the EU. They're not coming to our place anymore. Oh, damn, who are we going to get to do all these jobs? Oh, the care industry. No one's prepared to work for that amount of money. Even though we got minimum wage, no one's prepared to do care work for minimum wage. So we just started getting in loads of brown-skinned people. Now, for those who are really driven by immigration issues, to replace effectively white Eastern Europeans with brown South Asian people or black Africans has become quite the frustration, one might say, for some people. But that's exactly what's happened. And this is what this Farage is saying here. We replaced temporary workers from the EU with permanent workers from India, Nigeria, and elsewhere around the world. BBC News did point that out that under Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, visa requirements were loosened because of the people shortage caused by Brexit, allowing people from overseas to move to the UK. So Brexit basically made us really need some overseas workers. We were desperate, and so the Conservatives relaxed visa requirements, which was pretty interesting given their broadly anti-immigration stance. Brexit literally did the opposite of what Brexiteers said, and migration shot up. Okay, so then we've had a bunch of trade deals. So we've had India, the US, although it's not formally a trade deal, and the deal with the EU. And my opinion is that these have been broadly beneficial deals. The EU deal particularly, I think, is absolutely what we need to do, and we need to really rejoin the single market and the customs union. But of course, you've had the Daily Mail and Daily Express and Nigel Farage and Reform UK people jumping up and down, like ranting about this as if it's the worst thing on earth. And I saw one analysis, it's like 0.00001% of like whatever, and yet you're arguing like this is like rejoining Brexit, rejoining the EU. It's just like, calm down. But anyway, Nigel Farage, for all his shouting about this, when it came to debating this in the House of Commons, as an elected MP, this was the time he chose to go on holiday, which is exactly what he did as a UKIP member of European Parliament. He didn't turn up for fisheries meeting and then complain that the UK fishermen weren't getting what they want when he didn't vote on a single one of the bloody things to support UK fishermen. He's a lazy, elite manipulator. So I, for one, am shocked that a man who only turned up for one fisheries meeting out of 42 when he was MEP would decide to go on holiday when Parliament was sitting rather than during the 18 weeks it was closed. So Parliament was closed for 18 weeks, doesn't go on holiday. It then sits and he goes on holiday. Of course, previously, he was faffing about the United States trying to support Donald Trump. Okay, so Nigel Farage skips a crucial EU update to go on holiday in the latest shameless move. So those of you who don't know, people from outside of the UK might not realise that he was married to a German. All the time he was anti-EU, he's married to a German, and his children have German passports. So they get free movement of people, free movement around Europe. Because, anyway, it's a hilarious situation. The irony of his children having the privilege of free movement around Europe is quite incredible. So anyway, Nigel Farage skips a crucial EU update to go on holiday in the latest shameless move, says this news site. Nigel Farage was whined about the government's EU reset agreement, but it turned out he missed a key update to the Commons because he had gone on holiday to France, the south of France, to Nice. Here we have The Guardian reporting Nigel Farage missed the debate on Brexit reset because he is holidaying abroad. And I love this from Keir Starmer. Absolutely nails it here. So one of the things about the EU agreement, the UK EU agreement, is it has actually had a tangible effect on people's kind of lives in quite a practical way, but in a way that has probably more of an effect than people give it credit for. Right? We go on holiday quite a lot in the UK. Heathrow and Gatwick are hubs of global travel. They're airport hubs, right? And lots of people go on holiday to Europe. Europe's very close, and so it's relatively easy and relatively cheap for us to go to Europe, or it certainly used to be when we're in the EU. And when we left the EU, we then had to join the queues that were like non-EU people. So we used to just go straight through very easily through passport control with the EU kind of groupings. Now it takes a lot longer, and we couldn't use e-gates. Now with this new agreement, we can use e-gates, and that's going to make it very, very much easier for British people to move around Europe and go to Europe. So this is seen as quite a positive thing. Anyway.
We're taking other measures to get back control of our borders, including the Borders Bill, which gives our law enforcement enhanced powers, including terrorism-like powers. What did his party do? What did he do? He voted against them.
Nigel Farage.
And I'll tell you why he voted against them. Because they don't want to fix this problem, because it benefits them. It benefits them not to fix it.
Which is fascinating, because that's the same point that was made against Donald Trump when he refused to allow the bipartisan bill to fix the border to be passed in the run up to the November elections, because if they were seen to fix it, then they would have nothing to complain about and nothing to run on in the election. So that Langford border bill, the bipartisan border bill that was supposedly going to be the harshest, certainly bipartisan bill ever passed, Trump said, no, we can't do that. We need people to still be angry about the border so that we can get elected. Well, actually, this is what Keir Starmer's saying. He doesn't want to solve the problem because then then Reform have got nothing to run on.
It benefits them not to fix it. Party before country. It's very good he's standing in for the member for Clacton, I have to say.
So he's talking to the guy there with the silver hair. When he's saying he's standing in for the member for Clacton. So for those from outside the UK, so here you've got the new Reform MP there. She's just been voted in by 6 votes. You've got Richard Tice, and here's what's his name? Lee Anderson. So Lee Anderson is standing in for Nigel Farage in asking questions at question time. So thank you for standing in for the member from Clacton. Clacton is this sort of very pretty poor constituency that Nigel Farage is the MP of, but he never turns up to surgeries there because he's always gallivanting around the world, sucking Donald Trump's toes or whatever. So there's this joke that people are still looking for Nigel Farage in Clacton. He's been missing there since July last year. Anyway, here's Lee Anderson standing in for Nigel Farage. So Keir Starmer's saying, thank you for standing in for Nigel Farage.
It benefits them not to fix it. Party before country. It's very good he's standing in for the member for Clacton, I have to say. There was no sign of him yesterday at the EU. So he was the first through the E-gates somewhere to south of France. Nice work if you can get it. We're taking up.
So Nice working if you can get it. So he's gone to Nice and he's the first through the E-gates. He's literally one of the first people to profit from having the E-gate access to Europe. And he's one that's excoriating the government for doing this EU deal. Anyway, I just thought that's quite nice from Nigel Farage. So just a few more things. We're going to then pop into Sarah Potchin, who's the new MP for Reform, won by 6 votes, and everything I've heard her say has been pretty much terrible. And this is kind of typical Reform, which is, it seems to me, low on serious a desire to do politics that might involve working with other parties, no desire really to get knowledgeable about the subject she's talking on. We'll come to this in a second. Here is Victoria Derbyshire doing another good job on Newsnight.
Nigel Farage says he would stop the small boats. How would Reform stop the small boats?
Reform clearly is one of Reform's key
How would you do it? How would you stop people getting into the boats?
So any illegal immigrants that come to this country will be detained and deported back to where they come from.
I'm not asking about before that. How would you stop them getting into the boats in the first place?
We have a border force that could currently turn those boats around. We have a deal with France. It's not working. We're paying money to France for what? The boats are still coming through. So
the border force
about a will.
Would what? Do what?
It's about a will of the government in power. The Conservatives didn't have the will to turn the boats around. The Labour Party does not have the will to turn the boats around. We've seen immigration grow even faster in the last 10 months under this Labour government.
But basically what you're saying to me is you wouldn't be able to stop people getting in the boats.
Reform are the only party that will try and turn those boats around by instructing Border Force to do precisely that, which is currently...
And taking them back to France?
Yes.
There's no bilateral agreement with France for this. There's nothing in it for them.
What Reform want to do...
Plus there's international maritime law.
What Reform want to do is anybody that comes here illegally is deported back to where they come from.
I know that. I was asking about how you'd stop them getting into boats in the first place.
Just can't answer that. It's just a simple question. And actually, that's like your core thing are these illegal immigrants on boats, right? That's one of the absolute bedrocks of Reform issue. And she's like, we'd asked the border force to turn them around. Yeah. Well, you can send them back to France. So there's no agreement with France. I mean, the whole idea of when we were in the EU is we had an agreement with France. We had European agreements there, and you could send them back to the country they came from. You can't do that. We can't do that now. So it's all so problematic. Right. Just one more from her. This is on defence, and actually, for those of you who follow me because of Ukraine, this is very pertinent to that. So this is, again, Potchin against, this time, Barry Gardiner on GB News. Potchin shows a complete lack of understanding of what she's talking about. This is bad.
Another aspect that'll get people talking is defence.
Yes.
This whole access to this rearmament fund.
Yes.
Where are you on this? I mean, I've got to say.
So just to give you the foundation of knowledge here, so we have some very big global players in terms of defence, BAE Systems, etc. Europe is wanting to rearm. It's trying to raise funds, 150 billion to start with, of funding to rearm Europe, to and possibly even give some of that to Ukraine, or to rearm Ukraine can be done through that funding. But anyway, to rearm Europe. They've also got an already existing now defence strategy that says 65% of new items procured must come from inside the EU. Britain is not in the EU, right? And that $150 billion, if you know the French and you know many of the other European nations, they will not want to spend that $150 billion out that they are borrowing to ramp up their defence euros outside of the EU. I mean, that is so counterproductive for economic strategy for the EU. So obviously, they're not going to allow outside contractors to come in and access that money unless there's some agreement in place. And we knew that. I reported that to you. And that's right. If I was in the EU, I would be arguing the same thing. For example, it depends whether you live in a pure free market world, in which case you just put things out to tender and it goes to the cheapest possible place that you can get whatever you want, right? For, talking about quality as well and blah, blah, blah. But when you're working in trade blocks and when you have any kind of protectionism, then kind of free market economics goes out the window. Look at what Donald Trump is doing. It's the opposite free market economics. Now, when it comes to tendering for defence contracts, then you might want to prefer to give contracts to your own indigenous businesses, because then it generates employment. It's a money multiplier in the local economies where they're at, and then you get tax revenue. So it's massively beneficial to have manufacturing in your own country than to offshore that manufacturing when you're giving out those contracts, right? So we know that, and the EU, we know that the EU is not going to give UK companies those contracts unless we are in some kind of defence agreement with them. So part of that deal we did with the EU was to allow our defence companies to access the 150 billion euro funding. And also we got, fishing rights were on the table, but also agricultural products red tape was slashed, e-gates, youth mobility, all these kinds of things were being agreed upon, compromised, whatever. But we wanted access to that 150 billion euro funding. She doesn't seem to understand that she just thinks, well, they should just buy stuff from BAE Systems because BAE Systems are amazing, because I'm British and I say that they're amazing. We've got the best defence tech in the world, and so they should just buy from us. It's ridiculous that we go and have to do a deal. It's just so naive.
So we don't even know the costs of a lot of this stuff. All of that detail, of course, will come out in due course.
Look, I just don't understand what part of this deal is good for us. Our defence industry is leading in the world in terms of its technology and its ability to create weapons at the end of the day. Why are we having to pay millions, if not billions, to have access to bid for contracts? We're not talking about being, having any favourable treatment. We're just talking about having access to bid for contracts.
Because the EU have regulation about who can get those contracts, because they want to support their own industries like we would like to support our own industry. Why should we expect them to buy our stuff? And I bet you wouldn't be advocating for us to buy loads of stuff from Europe rather than BAE Systems. I bet you wouldn't be saying, look, why aren't we buying stuff from Rheinmetall? We should be buying more stuff from Rheinmetall. No, you're obviously not advocating that, because you're British and you would advocate for Britain to buy British stuff. And that's what Europe is doing.
For arms contracts. Now, the fact is, we are leading the way, so surely people should be paying us to be bidding for our contracts. Why are we giving in? This is no deal. This is another example of trying to fool the UK public. The UK public are not stupid. They know.
No, but you are.
that we have some of the best arms productions in the world. Why are we paying to even have the opportunity to win these deals?
Barry?
No, I think it's about co-production and what we do. And if you look at some of the best weaponry that we have been part of creating, is when we are corresponding with other countries and manufacturing together. And we will put part of the components in there. They will put part of the components in there, and then we sell it and we get a proportionate share of it. So it's our contribution to what we will be producing together.
Which Barry will have to.
And of course, BAE Systems won't be able to do that because it'll be European co-productions for, funded by European money. And so they won't want to have BAE Systems in there unless, Europe gets something back in response, which is access to fishing rights.
To pay millions to even get the opportunity to contribute. So that is no deal.
Well, I'm sorry, if it means, as Chopper actually said on the programme, that this is worth potentially £9 billion to our defence industries, then it's certainly one that the defence industries themselves, you said, well, look what the fishermen are saying. Let's look at what the defence industries are saying. They're saying we've been crying out for this. We were excluded. We're now back in the frame. We're going to be able to produce. We're going to be able to actually get the financial
It's not
benefit.
the defence industries that will have to be paying the millions, if not billions, to even get the opportunity to go down this road. It'll be, yet again, the British taxpayer sold out by the Labour government.
They are the ones who will get the jobs in those defence industries. They're the ones that will get the benefits of the tax that those industries will be paying, and it's worth a huge amount to this country.
Well, we'll see, but I would disagree with that wholeheartedly. I still don't understand why we have to pay to bid on these contracts.
You're not paying. You're doing a trade deal. Anyway, as Brendan May here says, good morning. I found someone thicker than Andrea Jenkins, who was the Reform mayor now, involved in the net zero, no net zero. Anyway, you're welcome, he says. Goodness me. So, that's a situation with Reform, which is that, I don't think there's a depth of nuance in understanding these things. I think as an MP, she just seems like she's woefully unprepared for the job, as many of the councillors are. You've got to wonder whether an upstart, reactionary, right-wing populist party can keep all of that, the broad centre of their electorate together enough by having a coherent enough policy platform. And I don't think they do. I think they're trying to do a bit of this and a bit of that, but actually ends up like, we're trying to sort out the rich people and cut corporate taxes while also saying, the poor people can do this. Well, okay, so is then the middle class going to be absolutely done by everything? In which case you're going to lose a middle class and so on and so forth. There's just, that's the difficulty of trying to run a political party, I guess. But I do worry that just like with MAGA republicanism, you can attract people on giving simple answers for very complex problems that are not good enough, and you end up getting found out when you then get into power, because those simple answers are, as I said, not good enough for complex problems. And I think that will be an issue for Reform until they become a more established party with much more nuanced political ideals. And I don't know if that's anything that will ever happen. I don't know. It's like saying MAGA will calm down and be sensible again. Well, no, they go back to Reagan republicanism. So, Reform would calm down and be sensible again if they get back to, I don't know, moderate conservatism maybe. But I don't know. Just concentrating on DEI and woke is just. I know some of you get really upset about this. I was speaking to my mate about this, who's a digital nomad, lives in Lisbon now. He came back and he's a little bit on that side of things, although he's mellowed out a bit on the woke stuff. And I said to him, look, mate, like if you're the sort of person that votes in an election because of trans toilets, then you're the person that has just been completely bamboozled by shiny things up here. Oh, look, trans toilets. Oh, how often has trans toilets affected your life? I said to my mate, like, honestly, how many minutes of your life have been affected by trans toilets other than arguing on Twitter? Never, right? Never. It's not an issue. So why has that become a voting issue? Why is trans a thing for us? Like, really, honestly, like, my position is who cares? It's just whatever. Like, like, these are the issues. So when you go, oh, trans this, or DEI that, DEI, and then everyone's like frothing at the mouth up here, and then you're putting through tax cuts for the rich down here and doing all this stuff that's tangibly bad for the electorate, you know, you are getting sold down the river. So woke stuff, which is what these guys are big on, DEI, net zero, woke. This is MAGA republicanism repackaged in the UK with the label Reform UK. And yeah, there might be elements, there might be many of you out there that are Reform voters, and you might disagree with a load of what I've said. Fair enough. There can be some sensible Reform voters. I'm sure there are. But there are also a lot of people who are just sucked in by stuff that is not as important as you think it is. And it allows for all sorts of evils to be allowed in under the radar. And that's what I worry about. And when you look at the policy platform of Reform at the moment, I think there are elements that are suggestive of some pretty problematic politics. Anyway, that's my tuppence. It's a long ramble. This is my big, long analysis of where Reform is, or what they're doing, or just a few nuggets here and there about what's been going on. Hopefully it was of interest to somebody. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.